Blood and dominance, these twin fixations, shaped the reign of Henry VIII. As his bloated frame deteriorated from within during the bleak winter of 1547, England's most infamous monarch confronted death with the same cold-blooded strategy that had driven him to eliminate 2 wives and numerous adversaries. "The lion is dying," whispered courtiers behind closed doors, yet his claws, though dulled, remained poised until the very last breath. This descent into physical and mental ruin had begun many years before, with a striking, athletic prince celebrated across Europe for his charm and vitality. How did this golden icon of the Renaissance become a monstrous figure, struggling to breathe in the flickering shadows of Whitehall Palace? The answer lies not merely in his notorious marital history, but also in a cascade of medical misfortunes that would deform both body and psyche beyond recognition. By the start of 1547, Henry had become a mere shadow of the man who had once competed in jousts alongside the greatest knights of Christendom. His body was ravaged by ailments. His legs were covered in oozing ulcers so pungent that members of the court fought back nausea in his presence. He had grown so large, some sources estimate up to 400 pounds, that special apparatuses were needed to help him move. His formerly striking features had become bloated and distorted, his eyes sunken into jaundiced flesh. The royal physicians had depleted their already limited treatments. Bloodletting, medicinal herbs, and even desperate prayers had all failed against the combination of diseases overwhelming their ruler. Today, many historians agree that Henry likely suffered from type 2 diabetes, gout, and potentially osteomyelitis, a severe bone infection that would account for the persistent torment in his legs. More alarming still was the decline of his mental faculties. His once feared temper had devolved into volatile fits of rage, alternating with periods of dazed exhaustion. And yet, even with death at the door, the court was consumed by the question of succession. Jane Seymour, Henry's third queen, had given birth to a long-awaited son, Edward, now a frail 9-year-old. But rival political groups were already plotting for control of the boy king in waiting. The Catholic conservative camp under the Duke of Norfolk clashed with Protestant reformers aligned with Edward Seymour, the prince's uncle. Henry, deeply suspicious until his final hours, was fully aware of these intrigues. Even as his hands trembled, he continued to authorize executions. The true state of his health, meanwhile, was one of the kingdom's most tightly held secrets. Official announcements continued to describe the king as robust and well, masking a grim and rapidly deteriorating reality. Those allowed into the king's inner sanctum witnessed a harrowing spectacle. A vast bed shrouded in heavy drapes, the cloying scent of decay masked by incense, and at the center what remained of a monarch who once embodied the might of England. Within the echoing corridors of Whitehall, staff whispered of anguished cries piercing the night as the dying king's pain reverberated through the stone walls. Henry's leg ulcers inflicted such unbearable torment that even minimal movements could unleash waves of searing pain. His doctors applied poultices made from concoctions as bizarre as boiled onions and ground human skullgrim, ineffective treatments that only intensified his misery. Some relief came through generous doses of opium, which numbed his suffering but further clouded his already faltering mental state. His mental anguish mirrored the physical pain. Once the most feared figure in England, whose mere words could seal any subject's fate, Henry now found himself at the mercy of his failing body. Court records reveal alarming signs of instability, bouts of near delirium, in which he muttered to himself about the specters of those he'd condemned, or called out the names of his long-dead wives. During rare moments of clarity, he became fixated on revising his will, desperate to dictate the future course of his dynasty from beyond the grave. Observers were unsettled by his oscillating religious convictions in these final days. Though he had severed ties with Rome to claim authority over the Church of England, Henry now appeared plagued by theological uncertainty, demanding Catholic rites one day, then reaffirming Protestant doctrine the next. His personal chaplain recorded chilling episodes where the king awoke in a panic from night terrors, claiming to see the apparitions of Thomas More, Anne Boleyn, and other victims of his reign, silently watching him from the foot of his bed-ghostly judges in his final hours. As death approached, a perilous void opened at the heart of power. Members of the Privy Council fractured into opposing camps, each vying for influence in the looming regency. Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, a veteran of the court's political minefields, was ultimately outflanked by Protestant rivals. In one of Henry's last ruthless acts, Norfolk was condemned to death for treason. In the king's name, though, fate intervened, and Henry died before the sentence could be carried out. On the 27th of January, 1547, the king suffered a dramatic breakdown. Witnesses described a violent seizure so intense that attendants had to physically restrain him. Afterward, he was unable to speak clearly. His right side struck by partial paralysis, what today would be diagnosed as a major stroke. Royal doctors, fearing disgrace or worse if they failed, launched a desperate attempt to save him. They seared his skin with heated irons and forced bitter remedies down his throat. Pushing the limits of Tudor medicine, control over the royal bedchamber fell to Henry's confidant, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, who managed access with extreme discretion. This strict secrecy served a purpose greater than preserving royal dignity. The revelation of Henry's impending death could trigger opportunistic power grabs or invite foreign threats. Cranmer restricted access to only the most essential attendants, binding them to total silence. Even Queen Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and surviving consort, was kept at arm's length during key phases of his decline. As January gave way to February, the king slipped in and out of consciousness. In fleeting moments of awareness, Henry reportedly voiced mounting fear about facing divine judgment. The ruler who had ordered the deaths of wives, nobles, and thousands of ordinary subjects now confronted his own mortality with growing despair. One courtier's diary recounts hearing the king murmuring prayers and pleading for forgiveness in his sleep, a striking reversal from the resolute sovereign who had redefined England's religious order through sheer determination. Official records reveal the extraordinary efforts undertaken to maintain a shred of royal dignity in his final days. With his bodily systems failing, teams of attendants rotated around the clock to perform the increasingly grim duties of cleansing and shifting the king's massive frame. His leg ulcers had worsened to such a degree that exposed bone could be seen through the rotting flesh. The stench became so unbearable that scented cloths became essential for anyone entering the chamber, and the windows were routinely thrown open, despite the harsh winter air, whenever the king lost consciousness. By the 27th of February, even the royal court could no longer sustain the illusion that recovery was possible. Archbishop Cranmer was hastily summoned as the king's breathing grew labored and shallow. Contemporary witnesses noted that, unable to speak, Henry was asked to press Cranmer's hand if he placed his trust in Christ rather than in the traditional rites he once upheld. With the last of his strength, Henry reportedly gave the signal an emotional gesture, later interpreted by Protestant chroniclers as a symbolic conversion at death's door. Henry VIII died before sunrise on the 28th of January, 1547. In death, his overwhelming physical bulk still dominated the room, his body a grim testament to a life of indulgence and agony. Officially, the cause of death was recorded as natural decay, though modern interpretations point to a fatal blend of heart failure, widespread infection, and complications from likely type 2 diabetes. Even more striking than his death was the veil of silence that enveloped it. For 3 full days, the Privy Council kept the king's passing secret, while they orchestrated a smooth consolidation of power around the young Edward VI. This calculated delay proved essential for a stable succession. As Henry's corpse cooled in the royal chamber, Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford and uncle to the new monarch, acted decisively. He convened covert meetings, fortified critical positions, and neutralized threats before the king's death was made public on the 31st of January. By the time London's bells rang to announce the end of the king's life, Edward Seymour had already assumed the titles of Lord Protector and Duke of Somerset, effectively becoming the de facto ruler of England in his nephew's name. The handling of Henry's body presented singular difficulties, shedding light on both Tudor-era funerary customs and the king's physical deterioration. At the time of his death, records indicate that decomposition began at an alarming rate, likely hastened by the infections that had ravaged his body long before he drew his final breath. Embalmers worked with urgency to ready the king's body, extracting internal organs and packing the cavities with aromatic herbs and preservatives. Yet even these seasoned professionals were reportedly stunned by what they discovered, particularly the king's inflamed heart and severely damaged liver. Henry's coffin required custom construction to fit his immense size, reportedly nearly twice the width of a typical noble's casket. The sheer weight of his remains demanded a reinforced bier and extra pallbearers for transportation. During his lying in state at Whitehall, witnesses claimed that the lead-lined coffin burst due to the buildup of gases from decomposition, causing fluids to seep out onto the chapel floor. This grisly episode was swiftly concealed, though some reports suggest dogs licked at the leaked remains, a horrifying final humiliation for a monarch so obsessed with regal dignity. The funeral procession to Windsor Castle on the 16th of February served as the Tudor regime's final opportunity to project Henry's authority from beyond the grave. Horses draped in black pulled the massive casket past crowds of mourners, while likenesses portrayed the king in his youthful prime rather than in his later grotesque state. At St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, Henry was interred beside Jane Seymour, only queen to give him a male heir and the only one spared disgrace, having died in childbirth before falling out of royal favor. The grim condition of Henry's decaying body stood in stark contrast to the legacy being curated in his name. Artists like Hans Holbein had immortalized Henry as a towering, broad-shouldered figure of strength feet, wide apart, hands on hips, gazing out defiantly. This visual mythology bore little resemblance to the sickly, disfigured corpse sealed beneath Windsor's stone floor. Yet the image would endure, becoming the quintessential depiction of Henry VIII for generations. His will revealed one final attempt at controlling the future. The 30-page document outlined a specific line of succession. First, to Edward, followed by Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, and finally to Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn. Despite a brief interruption by Lady Jane Grey's 9-day rule, the succession ultimately unfolded as Henry had dictated. His posthumous influence extended through all three of his children each, reigning as Tudor monarchs until the dynasty's end with Elizabeth I's death in 1603. More pressing, however, were the arrangements Henry had made for Edward's minority. He had appointed a regency council of 16 men to rule jointly until Edward reached adulthood, reflecting his deep suspicion of allowing too much authority to rest with any single noble. But this balance was swiftly undone, as Edward Seymour quickly outmaneuvered the others to claim the title of Lord Protector within mere days of Henry's death. The rapid unraveling of Henry's final directives underscored the fragile nature of royal authority. Once the imposing figure behind it was gone, the medical legacy of Henry's decline remains a topic of deep intrigue for both scholars and doctors. His condition has been variously interpreted over time, from syphilis to vitamin deficiencies. Yet, the strongest modern consensus points toward type 2 diabetes, compounded by chronic osteomyelitis. The King's medical notes detail increasingly frantic treatments, ranging from the gruesome application of halved live pigeons on his infected legs to bizarre elixirs made with gold and ground gemstones. These costly yet ineffective solutions highlight both the limits of Tudor-era medicine and the extraordinary lengths taken to care for a monarch of Henry's stature. What stands out most, however, are the personal artifacts found among his possessions after death. Amid the symbols of power-jeweled weapons, royal seals, diplomatic document servants uncovered a small locked box holding more intimate treasures. A miniature portrait of Jane Seymour, a lock of hair thought to belong to his mother, Elizabeth of York, and a child's handwritten prayer book, perhaps belonging to Elizabeth before Anne Boleyn's execution. These deeply personal items hint at the emotional core of a man, otherwise remembered for his ruthlessness. Even in his physical and mental decline, Henry seemed to preserve a connection to family and sentimentality. His death immediately reshaped England's political landscape. The Catholic conservatives, who had retained sway during his final years, were swiftly displaced as Edward Seymour established a firmly Protestant regency. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, who had administered Henry's final rites, now seized the moment to accelerate reforms the king had implemented more cautiously. Within just 2 years, the first English Book of Common Prayer was published, propelling England further along a Protestant path than Henry himself had ever envisioned. Henry's complex religious stance breaking with the papacy, while still embracing many Catholic rites, left behind a theological ambiguity. This allowed both Catholic and Protestant camps to claim him. The former pointed to his defense of transubstantiation and his opposition to Luther, while the latter highlighted his rejection of Rome's authority. This duality helped ignite the sectarian strife that defined the reigns of all three of his children. As the country swung from Edward's radical Protestantism to Mary's Catholic revival, and finally to Elizabeth's measured via media, the monarch's death also signaled a new chapter in Tudor propaganda. Having carefully fashioned Henry as the embodiment of national strength and anti-papal defiance, royal image makers now faced the daunting task of projecting that same authority onto a 9-year-old boy. Portraits of young Edward VI mimicked his father's signature stance legs spread, hands confidently positioned, implying strength through continuity. Ceremonial life reinforced this illusion, with courtiers expected to bow to Edward's vacant throne with the same devotion once reserved for his father. Beyond the court and politics, Henry's passing sent ripples across English society. For nearly 40 years, Henry VIII had personified sovereign authority, with his character and personal whims directly influencing government policy even at the most local levels. His death left behind not only a power vacuum, but a psychological one as well. Church records from early 1547 indicate a surge in public unease. There were more accounts of prophetic visions, unusual celestial signs, and even alleged sightings of apparition. For a people deeply rooted in religious symbolism, the passing of such a commanding monarch naturally invoked apocalyptic fears. Reactions abroad reflected England's delicate position in European politics. The French ambassador reported that King Francis I genuinely grieved for his beloved brother of England, despite years of rivalry. Meanwhile, Emperor Charles' nephew to Catherine of Aragon took a more strategic view, speculating whether a realm ruled by a child king might now be open to influence or even invasion. Pope Paul III, who had excommunicated Henry years prior, was said to have held a mass for the monarch's Sullan Act. That was both a diplomatic acknowledgement of Henry's importance and a reassertion of the Church's spiritual claim over him. The very room where Henry died, his private quarters at Whitehall Palace, gained near-mythic status almost immediately. Courtiers grew hesitant to enter the chambers where the king had endured his final agonies. Reports of mysterious sounds and unexplained chills circulated quickly. Edward VI, then only a child, is said to have refused to sleep in his father's bed, demanding entirely new quarters. This atmosphere of lingering unease reveals the profound psychological impact Henry's death had on his inner circle, many of whom had built their entire identities around serving and appeasing his volatile will. Henry's final illness is among the most extensively documented royal deaths in history, offering rare insight into Tudor medical practices. His doctors meticulously recorded every treatment administered during his decline, records preserved largely to prove that no effort had been spared. These writings reveal a hybrid of ancient and emerging techniques. Galenic traditions like hot cupping were used to expel bad humors, while herbal remedies based on classical authorities were prescribed alongside nascent hydrotherapies. That none of these treatments brought relief underscores the limited tools available even to the most skilled healers of the time. Henry's fixation on legacy extended beyond his lifetime. He left specific instructions for a tomb intended to dwarf all other Sa monument, featuring 40 life-sized bronze figures and a towering centerpiece with an equestrian statue of himself. This colossal vision captured both his ego and his concern over how posterity would remember him. Ironically, the project was never completed. Financial strain halted its progress, and the bronze sculptures were later melted down during the English Civil War, a fate that would have enraged the legacy-obsessed king. In the immediate aftermath of his death, the royal court saw a frenzy of repositioning. Some individuals rushed to align themselves with the new order, while others hurried to distance themselves from a now dangerous legacy. Nobles who had fallen from grace during Henry's final years began reappearing at court, while those who had once benefited from his patronage scrambled to secure new alliances for protection. Surviving letters from royal attendants reveal touching accounts of longtime servants suddenly left without roles after decades spent tending to the king's personal whims. For many, the transition was insurmountable. The talents required to navigate Henry's volatile moods held little value in the more restrained, bureaucratic environment of Edward VI's reign. Some former intimates, overwhelmed by the pace of political upheaval, took their own lives in the wake of the king's death. Arguably more consequential than the personal fallout was the institutional shift his passing triggered. Henry's death marked the beginning of a major evolution in English governance, from the unchecked rule of a sovereign whose word was law, to a more moderated system involving cooperation between the monarchy and elite councillors. Edward Seymour, as Lord Protector, lacked Henry's commanding presence and thus leaned heavily on the council's support. Though Mary would briefly restore autocratic rule, this structural pivot paved the way for a more balanced model of power under Elizabeth, contributing to the constitutional framework that would later define England. Paradoxically, the monarch, who had consolidated royal authority with unprecedented force, also ushered in its gradual decline. Henry's prolonged decline became the subject of enduring medical curiosity. Over the centuries, physicians have reinterpreted his ailments through the lens of their times. Victorian doctors, shaped by moralistic attitudes toward illness, blamed syphilis casting his deterioration as divine punishment for his sexual indiscretions. By the early 20th century, diagnoses shifted toward metabolic illnesses like diabetes and gout. Contemporary medical historians suggest more nuanced conditions, including MacLeod syndrome, a rare hereditary disorder that could account for both his physical breakdown and erratic behavior, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, possibly stemming from multiple injuries sustained during his jousting youth. The treatment of Henry's personal belongings after death sheds light on Tudor beliefs surrounding mortality and memory. Court records indicate that items touched by the king in his final days were handled with reverence, even preserved as relics, despite the official Protestant dismissal of such practices. His last set of nightclothes, stained with bodily fluids, was ceremonially burned by order of Cranmer, an act meant to blend sanitation with symbolic closure. More precious possessions, such as his vast collection of celestial instruments and navigational charts, were meticulously recorded and either distributed in accordance with his will or retained for the education of young Edward. The aftermath of Henry's death also deeply affected his surviving family. Catherine Parr, his last wife, maintained the outward decorum of widowhood, while quickly arranging to wed her longtime love, Thomas Seymour, a union she had postponed during the king's life. 9-year-old Edward, king in title but tightly managed by his Seymour relatives, made only a brief, emotionless mention of his father's death in his personal diary. The emperor's ambassador was commanded to come home on the 4th of January, upon the death of the king, my father, whose soul God pardon. The cold tone suggests a distant, perhaps formal bond between the boy and the larger-than-life monarch whose shadow he now inherited. At the same time, Henry's daughters were forced to confront their own precarious roles within the shifting political landscape. Mary, now 31, remained a devout Catholic and grew increasingly estranged from the Protestant reforms ushered in by her half-brother's administration. Elizabeth, still only 13, had to tread carefully at court, her status undermined by her mother's execution and the persistent doubts over her legitimacy. Both would eventually wear the crown their father had intended for them. But their paths to power were fraught with peril. Mary narrowly escaped death during Wyatt's rebellion, while Elizabeth endured confinement in the Tower during her sister's reign. The final hours of Henry's life reveal the stark solitude that can accompany even the mightiest rulers. Though his bedchamber was filled with attendants, physicians, and nobles, contemporary reports imply that Henry met his end in a profound and personal isolation, separated from others, not only by his sovereign role, but by the deeply individual nature of death. Archbishop Cranmer's effort to offer comfort yielded little more than a silent handclasp from the dying king. The monarch, who once ruled with unquestioned authority, ultimately faced his final passage alone, a solemn reminder that death levels even the highest of thrones. The months following Henry's death laid bare the extent of his personal domination over English rule. Bureaucratic records show a pileup of unresolved matters, many trivial enough to be handled by subordinates, yet delayed for royal approval due to a culture of unquestioning loyalty. Under Edward's regency, the government was forced to evolve. Without the king's constant oversight, administration had to become more autonomous. Though this period of adjustment was initially disorganized, it marked a significant shift toward more stable institutional governance systems that would no longer depend solely on a monarch's whims. Henry's funeral procession offered a final, theatrical assertion of Tudor sovereignty. Eyewitness accounts describe black velvet-draped horses, heralds carrying symbolic arms, and a full-size wax likeness of the king, decked in regal attire, placed atop his coffin. This surrogate figure masked the rapidly decomposing reality beneath. The multi-day journey from London to Windsor allowed thousands to witness this final assertion of royal majesty. The ceremony's precision reflected the anxieties surrounding dynastic succession, aiming to reassure the nation that although the king had died, the institution of monarchy remained intact. In the wake of the king's death, the fate of his medical staff became uncertain. Some of the royal physicians quickly transitioned into service under new patrons, while others were shunned for their perceived failure to preserve the monarch's life. Dr. Thomas Wendy, who had shown rare courage in warning Henry of his impending demise when others feared to speak, managed to secure continued influence in Edward VI's court. The apothecaries came under particular investigation. Officials scrutinized the medicines administered in Henry's last weeks, probing for signs of incompetence or worse, intentional acceleration of death. Later, forensic evaluations of Henry's remains, carried out during renovations in the 19th century, offered new evidence about his health at the time of death. Workers reported uncovering a massive skeleton matching Henry's known size, along with signs of extreme joint damage, especially in his lower limbs. Contemporary forensic analysis of historical medical documentation suggests that Henry may have weighed as much as 400 pounds at the time of his death, with a waistline surpassing 50 inches. This extreme obesity, paired with compromised blood flow in his lower limbs and the festering sores noted by his contemporaries, likely created the perfect conditions for the systemic infection sepsis that hastened his demise. Yet perhaps the most telling aspect of Henry's final chapter is what it reveals about the fragility of power itself. The monarch who had altered the course of England's religion, dispatched queens and nobles at will, and laid the groundwork for naval supremacy, was ultimately powerless against his body's collapse. Documents from the royal court recount episodes where Henry erupted at his doctors, demanding a cure, as if royal decree alone could defy nature. This tragic resistance to the inevitable underscores the paradox at the heart of autocratic rule, that no authority, however absolute, can shield a mortal body from illness and death. The murkiness of Henry's spiritual state at the end of his life opened the door to conflicting interpretations. Protestant writers emphasized moments that suggested a last-minute embrace of evangelical faith, while Catholic commentators abroad portrayed a man haunted by remorse for his schism with Rome. However, the bulk of available evidence indicates that Henry remained true to his distinctive theological stance, declaring himself the supreme head of the English Church, while continuing to uphold core Catholic rituals. This hybrid religious identity, ritually Catholic but politically anti-papal, mirrored Henry's broader habit of molding institutions to fit his personal agenda rather than aligning with any established doctrine. The economic fallout of Henry's death extended well beyond the palace walls. Government ledgers reveal that the Regency inherited a treasury in crisis, along with heavily debased coinage, a legacy of Henry's costly military ventures and personal opulence. Some estimates place his total expenditure on royal residences at a staggering modern equivalent of £200 million. This fiscal emergency compelled Edward Seymour to persist with the dissolution of monastic properties, furthering one of the most massive redistributions of land in England's history. The economic strain triggered by Henry's extravagance contributed to inflation and widespread unrest that would dog his successors. Henry's deteriorating body came to symbolize more than just personal decay. It became a metaphor for national decline. Just as medieval thinkers envisioned the monarch as the body politic's head, Tudor commentators saw the king's festering wounds as reflecting deeper moral and societal corruption. Sermons delivered in 1547 explicitly compared the king's diseased limbs to spiritual decay infecting the nation. Reformist voices seized on this imagery, arguing that England, like its king, required thorough cleansing and renewal, especially in matters of faith. The twilight of Henry VIII's reign stands at the crossroads between medieval and emerging modern views of kingship. On the one hand, the emphasis on ceremonial mourning and succession anxieties echoed ancient royal customs passed down for centuries. On the other hand, the meticulous medical documentation, the structured clarity of Henry's testament, and the seamless function of government institutions marked a transition toward a more modern conception of state authority. In this way, Henry's passing symbolized the end of one epoch, and the emergence of another was the final English monarch to embody medieval absolutism, yet also a forerunner of the centralized administrative power that would shape future regimes. What makes the death of Henry VIII so hauntingly powerful is not merely the morbid physical decline or its political consequences, but the profound reflection it offers on mortality itself. The ruler who had imposed his will upon an entire nation was, in the end, reduced to confronting the same inescapable truths that govern every human life. Eyewitnesses reported that Henry, in his final hours, was gripped by moments of deep existential fear, no longer a monarch issuing commands, but a mortal soul anticipating divine reckoning. The Archbishop of Canterbury, according to some sources, gently reminded him during the administration of last rites, "You are soon to appear before a power where rank holds no sway and no crown offers protection." And in that ultimate moment of shared human frailty, perhaps England's most feared and controversial sovereign found an unexpected bond with his people, not through dominance, but through the universal experience of death.